Well, hello, everybody. My name's Jessica, and today I'm going to talk about the fifth mindfulness training, which is nourishment and healing. And what this is about is ethical consumption or consuming in a way that reduces our suffering and reduces the suffering in the planet. And so today, as I was doing walking meditation, I started to pay attention to how often did I think about consuming something. I'll be very honest, today maybe 0.1% of my meditation was how can I generate compassion for others? 40% was what's for dinner? Where am I going to get it? What restaurant will I go to? Will I get groceries? What will I cook? And I noticed when I passed by the Ricola, I heard that Ricola. And I realized, wow, I've been so branded by this company that even here in the meditation room, walking by and seeing it triggers that thought. And fortunately, when I walked by the donate sign, I thought, well, I give monthly. So few, at least I've contributed in that part. But it was interesting how many times I thought about consuming just in this room with very limited input. And so tonight we're going to look specifically at the fifth mindfulness training, which is about nourishment and healing. And so to get started, let's just go back to what are the five mindfulness trainings in general. The five mindfulness trainings are adaptations of the five Buddhist precepts for modern life. So Thich Nhat Hanh and his community looked at the five precepts and said, this is how they make sense for the modern world, and anybody can apply them of any denomination. They're universal, but they are based on the five Buddhist precepts. And we've got the transmission ceremony coming up, and I did the mindfulness transmission at Deer Park Monastery in San Diego. And it was really, really cool. They give you the booklet, like we have the brochure here. And, they gave me a Dharma name, which I got tattooed on my arm, Awakening Stream of the Heart. And it's just a really cool and special experience. If anybody's considering taking the trainings, it's a cool way to enhance your practice and be connected to the Sangha. So you might be wondering, what are the five Buddhist precepts? The first one sounds pretty easy at first. That's the one about non-killing. It's like, well, of course not. I'm not like a ruthless murderer. No problem. Until it's dinner time, right? And it's like, wait, am I going to take the life of a fish, an animal? Are vegetables sentient? And what's going on? It's like, well, wait, when I die, they're going to eat me too. My body's going to decay. The worms will eat it. So, okay, gosh, already it's so hard to think, how do I not kill? And number two, abstain from taking what isn't given, non-stealing and ethical behavior. And so this is one that plays into consumption too in a lot of ways. Number three is to abstain from sensual misconduct or sexual misconduct, using sexual energy in a way that could cause harm to yourself or others. The fourth one is to abstain from false speech. And the final one is to abstain from intoxicants that tend to cloud the mind. So these five mindfulness trainings are also meant to express the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. So, the Buddha, when he had his moment of enlightenment, came up with the Four Noble Truths. The first one is like there's suffering. So when we do suffer, it's to be expected. Some people might suffer and go, what's wrong with me? What did I do? And it's like, well, you were born human. There's no way around it. But the Buddha said, even though there is suffering, there's a cause of suffering. And he said, if there's a cause of suffering, there can be an end to suffering. And he said, the way to get there is to go down the Eightfold Path. And so I've got a pop quiz for y'all. Let's see if we can all name the parts of the Eightfold Path. If you've got one, just go ahead and
Mindful action.
Mindful action. Yeah, nice.
Right view.
Right view, yeah.
Right livelihood.
Right livelihood, got it.
Right speech.
Right speech, yeah.
Right diligence.
Right diligence. I think that's like right effort. Yeah. Right concentration, yeah, got it. Right mindfulness, yeah. I think there's one left I haven't heard. Right view.
Right action.
Right view is also one. The one I think I haven't heard is right. Right understanding? Not quite the kind of clothes. Right speech. This one's more about like a motivation. Right intention. Okay, cool. Wow, nice job. I think we got them all right. And so the idea when we practice the 5 mindfulness trainings is that it's going to cultivate right view, which is the insight of interbeing. And once we have this insight, we're able to remove discrimination, intolerance, anger, fear, and despair, knowing we're on the path of a bodhisattva, an enlightened being who keeps coming back until all sentient beings are free of suffering, gives us a sense of purpose in the present moment and allows us to cultivate compassion and understanding for all beings. So the 5 mindfulness trainings take on the 5 precepts. The first one is reverence for life, where we protect life and we also decrease violence in ourselves, our families, and our society. The next one is true happiness, which involves practicing social justice, generosity, avoiding stealing and exploiting other living beings, which when we consume, to mindfully consume, we need to consider, was labor exploited to produce this? Child labor, slave labor, people in poor working conditions. And then we've also got true love. This is about responsible sexual behavior to protect individuals, couples, families, and children. The 4th mindfulness training is loving speech and deep listening, where deep listening and loving speech are used to restore communication and reconcile. But the one we're going to focus on is nourishment and healing, mindful consumption that avoids bringing toxins and poisons into the body or mind. So let's read through the training itself, which is called Nourishment and Healing. And I think the cool thing about these trainings is you can read them over and over and over again and find something new that comes to you every single time. So as I read it, just kind of see what comes to mind for you and the sort of reflections you get from listening to it. So it says, aware of the suffering caused by unmindful consumption, I'm committed to cultivating good health, both physical and mental, for myself, my family, and my society, by practicing mindful eating, drinking, and consuming. I will practice looking deeply into how I consume the 4 kinds of nutriments, namely edible foods, sense impressions, volition, and consciousness. I'm determined not to gamble or to use alcohol, drugs, or any other products which contain toxins, such as certain websites, electronic games, TV programs, films, magazines, books, and conversations. I will practice coming back to the present moment, to be in touch with the refreshing, healing, and nourishing elements in me and around me, not letting regrets and sorrow drag me back into the past, nor letting anxiety, fear, or craving pull me out of the present moment. I am determined not to try to cover up loneliness, anxiety, or other suffering by losing myself in consumption. I will contemplate, interbeing, and consume in a way that preserves peace, joy, and well-being in my body and consciousness, and in the collective body and consciousness of my family, my society, and the earth. Okay, so something really interesting about this is the types of things we can consume. So probably when we think of consumption, a lot of us think of food, maybe we think of going shopping and buying consumer goods, but this also includes sense impressions, volition, and consciousness. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. First of all, edible foods. Yeah, we want to make sure, are there chemicals on these foods that are going to cause harm? How were the animals treated? Or should we even become vegetarian or vegan? If I consume this food, is it going to increase my health, decrease my health? What about the way it's grown and the components in it? And so you can see already that's a lot to think about. And we got to think about it at least 3 times a day, usually. Then we've got the sense impressions. So these come through our physical sense organs, the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and skin. And they involve the sights, the sounds, the smells, the taste, and the touch in your environment. So I thought, in the Tao Te Ching, there's a really interesting passage about the sense impressions. And what it says is that colors blind the eye, sounds deafen the ear, flavors numb the taste, thoughts weaken the mind, desires wither the heart. The master observes the world, but trusts his inner vision. He allows things to come and go. His heart is open as the sky. So that just makes me think about this idea of like guarding our sense gates. You know, like the monastics, when they leave the monastery, will always take a buddy with them because the energy of the monastery is so refined and so pure. And then the second you go out into the normal world, it's like advertisement, consumption, you know, lust, and like all this energy. And it's like for them to stay centered in the practice, it helps to have another friend who's so deep into it. And so, you know, it's just worth remembering, like, as we're maybe zoning out and looking at a screen, like what sort of images are coming to us when we're listening to conversations. Are they pleasing or not? I remember one time I was listening to this group of girls basically talking trash about someone. And they were saying, oh, she's so terrible, and oh, blah, blah, blah. And I was thinking, gosh, the more they talk, the worse I feel. Like I started to get grumpy. I started to feel physically uncomfortable around them. And I remember saying, could you change the topic? And they just looked at me and they're like, no. And they just started like tearing her down even more. I'm like, okay, well, I can change where I'm sitting then. I'm going to stand up. I'm going to go somewhere else because I can physically feel this like negative conversation bringing me down. So, you know, you can just be aware of whether you're the one speaking or even just listening to other people, how what you're hearing might impact you. And then on the positive side, you know, we can give ourselves positive affirmations and say kind things about ourselves and build ourselves up, or listening to healing music and things like that, and use those sense impressions to reduce suffering. Then there's volition. So this is what actually drives you. It's your motivations, your plans, your ambitions. So, you know, if you have a goal, you can look at, why do I want that goal? Is it to reach fame? Is it, you know, greed? Or is it like an act of service or an expression of my passion that'll bring healing and bring a benefit to the planet? You know, is my motivation going to create joy in myself and others, or is it going to create more suffering for people? And to the best we can try to refine our volition so that we're acting from a place that brings us peace and cultivates compassion. Although I know it can be tricky sometimes if there's difficult emotions to deal with, like anger or fear. And that's why in our practice, we say like, hey, when I'm filled with that strong emotion, like anger, I'm going to practice not speaking. I'll just pause and try to look deeply at the roots of my anger and try to prevent ourselves from speaking while we're still in that, like, you know, animalistic brain. But those are just some examples of how like our volition can affect the way we feel. And the last one is consciousness. So these are like the ways of thinking, the worldview, and the perspective. And so when we come here, it's much more peaceful. We've got the Buddha Kshetra, the Buddha force field around the building. And we're coming here and talking about how can we be more compassionate and kind toward people. So like the consciousness here is very pleasant, very uplifting. We could go somewhere else and it's a totally different consciousness. Like it could be very competitive. It could be very consumer driven. And so, you know, it's just worth paying attention to what is underneath what we're consuming as far as the consciousness goes. Even when we're looking at like media, like TV shows, movies, books, like who wrote it? Why did they write it? Is it created to prevent suffering, or is it actually creating more suffering? And something I love about the mindfulness trainings is they're not hard and fast rules like thou shalt not eat sugar or something. It's like, decide for yourself. Do you like eating sugar? Do you feel like it brings suffering or not? Are there ways to mindfully consume sugar? You know, whatever element it is, we get to explore for ourselves and decide for ourselves what feels right for us. And so one person may become full vegan, another person may not be able to do that. But even still, as long as we're considering what this means for us, we're still going to make a difference in the world. And so to look more at the 4 kinds of nutriments, there is a sutra about this, the Puddhamamsa Sutta. So it goes like this. This is what I heard one time when the Buddha was in the Anathapindika monastery in the Jeta Grove near to the town of Shravasti. That day, the Buddha told the monks, there are 4 kinds of nutriments which enable living beings to grow and maintain life. What are these 4 nutriments? The first is edible food. The second is the food of sense impression. The third is the food of volition. And the fourth is the food of consciousness. Bhikkhus, how should a practitioner regard edible food? Imagine a young couple with a baby boy whom they look after and raise with all their love. One day they decide to bring their son to another country to make their living. They have to go through the difficulties and dangers of a desert. During the journey, they run out of provisions and fall extremely hungry. There's no way out for them, and they discuss the following plan. We only have one son whom we love with all our heart. If we eat his flesh, we shall survive and manage to overcome this dangerous situation. If we do not eat his flesh, all 3 of us will die. After this discussion, they killed their son. With tears of pain and gritting their teeth, they ate the flesh of their son, just so as to be able to live and come out of the desert. The Buddha asked, do you think the couple ate their son's flesh because they wanted to enjoy its taste and because they wanted their bodies to have the nutriment that would make them more beautiful? The monks replied, no, Venerable Lord. The Buddha asked, were the couple forced to eat their son's flesh in order to survive and escape from the dangers of the desert? The monks replied, yes, Venerable Lord. The Buddha taught monks, every time we ingest edible food, we should train ourselves to look at it as our son's flesh. If we meditate on it in this way, we shall have clear insight and understanding, which puts an end to misperceptions about edible food, and our attachment to sensual pleasures will dissolve. Once the attachment to sensual pleasures is transformed, there are no longer any internal formations concerning the 5 objects of sensual pleasure in the noble disciple who applies himself to the training and the practice. When the internal formations still bind us, we have to keep returning to this world. So this already is pretty wild. I'm used to like, oh, I'm hungry. Let's have more Cheetos, yummy, another bag, whatever. But here it's like every time you eat, consider it's the sun that you're eating the flesh of, or else you're going to starve in the desert, and contemplate, that it's nourishing you, and that's why you need the food. It's like, okay, that's a pretty sobering, far out way of thinking about eating. So let's see what else the Buddha said. He said, how should the practitioner meditate on the food of sense impressions? Imagine a cow which has lost its skin. Wherever it goes, the insects and maggots which live in the earth, in the dust, and on the vegetation attach themselves to the cow and suck its blood. If the cow lies on the earth, the maggots in the earth will attach themselves to it and feed off of it. If she goes down into the water, the insects in the water will attach themselves to it and feed off of it. If she stands in the open space, the insects in the air will attach themselves to it and feed off of it. Whether lying down or standing up, the cow will be irritated and suffer pain. When you ingest the food of sense impressions, you should practice to see it in this light. You'll have insight and understanding, which puts an end to misperceptions concerning the food of sense impressions. When you have this insight, you will no longer be attached to the 3 kinds of feeling. When no longer attached to the 3 kinds of feeling, the noble disciple does not need to strive anymore, because whatever needs to be done has already been done. So next, how should we meditate on the food of volition? Imagine a village or large town near a pit of burning charcoal. There's only the smokeless, glowing embers left. Now, there's an intelligent man with enough wisdom who doesn't want to suffer, and he only wants happiness and peace. He doesn't want to die, and he only wants to live. He thinks over there the heat is very great, although there's no smoke and there's no flames. But if I have to go into that pit, there's no doubt I shall die. Knowing this, he's determined to leave the large town or the village and go somewhere else. Practitioners should meditate like this on the food of volition. Meditating like this, they will have insight and understanding, which puts an end to misperceptions about the food of volition. When they arrive at that understanding, the 3 kinds of craving will be ended. When these 3 cravings are ended, the noble disciple who trains and practices will have no more work to do, because whatever needs to be done has already been done. And then finally, how should the practitioner meditate on the food of consciousness? Imagine the soldiers of the king have arrested a criminal. They bind him and bring him to the king. Because he's committed theft, he's punished by people piercing his body with 300 knives. He's assailed by fear and pain all day and all night. Practitioners should regard the food of consciousness in this light. If they do, they'll realize a clear insight and understanding on the food of consciousness. When they have this insight and understanding about the food of consciousness, they'll realize insight and clear understanding about the psyche soma. When they have insight and clear understanding about the psyche soma, noble disciples who train and practice will not strive anymore, because whatever needs to be done has been done. And it says, after the Buddha spoke, the monks were very happy to put the teachings into practice. So I think that's also why they updated it for the modern human too. Yeah, a lot of those sound pretty foreign to our current society right now. So, today the things we need to think about really are things like labor practices. Is this coming from sweatshop labor? Are workers being treated fairly? We need to think about the environment. Are these sources sustainable? Like I remember as a teacher, I found out about the Great Pacific Garbage Heap. And then a few years later, one of my students reported on the 5 garbage gyres in the ocean. I'm like, that's really scary. The first one was bad enough, but then I look, how can I stop consuming plastic? And it's like, wow, that's a lot harder than it seems. Even if you're not buying extra plastic stuff, everything you're already buying has plastic stuff. And then it brings up questions of what are all these chemicals doing to our environment? There's like environmental endocrine disruptors and other things like that. So it's a great reminder of the interconnectedness of all beings, but also kind of alarming sometimes when we look at our consumption. So at the monastery, they did this practice called I Have Enough. And every time they rang the bell at this particular retreat, you just think, I have enough. And for a while, I tried it. Instead of buying new plates and bowls, I had one bowl, one plate, a placemat, and a spoon and a fork. The second I bought it, I felt kind of relieved. I looked around the store at all the other plates and bowls. I thought, I don't need any of those. This is cool. But eventually it's like, well, I started buying new things again. So the thing to look at is, why are we consuming? Is it a true need? Are we consuming skillfully, or are we possibly influenced by all the advertisements, the mass consumerism, the push to acquire more? Or are we maybe covering up deeper emotional pain? Like I did at the monastery when we had mindful eating. And at first I was observing how delicious it was. And then I was observing how I was full, but I kept eating anyway. And then I observed how it didn't even taste good, but I kept cramming in my mouth. And let me tell you later, I was very mindful of how upset my stomach felt and like very in the present moment and going, why? But I found out there were emotions under there, right? Like maybe a deep sadness or something I didn't want to feel. But only by being mindful while eating could I even observe the process I was going through. So for everyone, it might be slightly different, but I will go ahead and close with this gatha that reminds us about how what we consume is connected to all beings, and it's called throwing out the garbage. So it says, in the garbage, I see a rose. In the rose, I see compost. Everything is in the transformation, and impermanence is life. So thanks for listening. I'm excited to hear during our sharing what y'all thought about some of these different ideas.